It is becoming more and more talked about and a prominent topic of conversation due to AI initiatives. At a practitioner level, when you're in operations, it can feel like something abstract. We're talking about one thing, but it's expressed in different ways. Hello, my name is Celine Millinder. I work at ICP as a Senior Global Operations Manager. I've been with ICP for a year. I would like to discuss governance, but really about the different types of governance you have. The strategic governance, big G, the operational governance, small g, and how you need both to be successful in AI initiatives, digital asset management, as well as innovation and content. When you ask different people about governance, they will have very different answers. When I asked 5 of my colleagues, they all had an answer which was not wrong, simply they were different. And that was really based on where they sat in the organization, which I found very interesting. And then I also turned to a CFO and asked them about governance. And they almost just said, why are we even talking about this? Governance is just governance. It gets done. You get on with it and you move on. I got 2 very different or distinct point of views on governance. On the one hand, it's very much a non-negotiable that you have to do. But then when you speak to the other colleagues who are more on the operational side, it is very much something that they live and breathe day by day. When we talk about it, we should talk about it in 2 distinct ways. The big G governance, which is the one that sets the direction, which is at executive level. And then you have that small g, which is that governance at the operational level. It's when that policy is then transitioned into a behavior within the company. So it's not to say that one is right or wrong, but often when we're on our operational side, we do use the word governance when we really are referring to more protocols, processes, ways of working. It really is what sets the direction for an organization. It is that board level accountability, that executive oversight and enterprise risk and compliance measures. It's also your AI frameworks that you're setting up in the organization. What we are really talking about here, because as you know, governance, we could go down the etymology, but really here we're focusing on more of the corporate governance. And when we look at that big G, you have what the organization decides for itself, and then you have what the world requires of it. And the latter is a non-negotiable. We keep it in mind as that is where we set direction. That is where we are accountable if things go wrong. So that is the principle of the big G. And then when we look at the small g, that is the operationalization of those legal requirements. So it's no longer best practice. This is just an obligation. It must happen. But that operationalization could be the most challenging because of the way the organization is set up. But if we bring it into practical perspectives, you have your GDPR regulations, but it's of no use if in your dam you don't have, an expiration date or a way of expiring content that should no longer be used. We know that GDPR varies, sometimes even from one country to another, but those guidelines have to come from that big G. In essence, that small g is very much that operationalization of that big G, and that is what happens in the dam. And the dam, because it's at the crossroads of so many elements such as brand, reputation, like IP, content, copyright, all of these elements, it is very much somewhere where those policies become behavior. And it's almost like a microcosm of that big G. That big G and small g is not in competition. It very much, both of them are very important. One sets the direction at that big G level, and the other one is the one that makes sure that you are traveling in that direction. I suppose that's what makes me so interested in this, in governance. It's because for me, it's not admin. From an operational perspective, it is very much operations. It's the day-to-day. how do we translate it into workflows that practitioners are willing to use? That is the challenge. So if we delve a little bit deeper into those external factors, we can break them down into layers. At the top layer, you have your global legislation, which is a mixture of, the laws around data privacy, the laws around AI or safeguarding, and all of which will impact an organization regardless of where they sit, what sector they sit in. And then you've got your copyright and IP laws as well. Then if you go to a second layer, which is a little bit more defined, that is the regulations that come at a sector level. So dependent on where you operate, that will shape your big G governance. If we look at financial sector, for example, they very much will be concerned about, those financial promotions standards. And then you have your healthcare and life sciences. They will be concerned about patients' data obligations. And then you have the public sector, which have standards that you have to comply with, such as accessibility. You might also have that freedom of information. And then finally, we also have advertising and media, which are heavily regulated around, claims that are made, or even images, how those are being used or retouched and so on. And that really is felt in the content operations in the sense that the regulations really touch every layer of content. You've got your claims around the copy, you've got the retouched images that you use, especially in the beauty sector. There are incredible amounts of regulations that you need to follow, even in packaging, whether it's PPWR or other regulations. And these will go through the DAM, but also your PIM. So we talked about the two first layers. So we talked about the global legislation, we talked about the sector-specific regulations, and then you've got that organizational specific standards, what the organization chooses to do. But that will be inevitably based on the two first layers. And that will be your brand and editorial guidelines, for example. It will be your AI framework. What tools can your employees use? How can they use it? And for what purpose? So all of these guidelines have to come from that big G level, but they will be informed by those external factors. So you will also have content lifecycle, which is also decided at that big G level. Because then when you come back to your DAM, that will then be applied at that small g level with your expiration date or your archival workflows. So you can see how the two are incredibly important. So the one big G is designed from those external factors, but equally, it has to think about how is it going to be operationalized down the line. And that's where the small g is really important. And that small g needs to be designed very closely with that big G in mind. What we see from these three different layers that inform that big G is that it can't be delegated downwards. It has to be dealt with at that level before it can be successfully sent to that small g level to be operationalized. I know we're all thinking about AI. It is really front of mind, especially as it's becoming a geopolitical tool rather than just a technology. There are still big questions that are still unresolved, and that the board of organizations is asked to own. And there are contested questions still in most jurisdictions, and that could be around, if we train AI on licensed content, does that require a new license, for example? Who owns content that is created by AI? And then finally, fair use. How does that apply to AI created content? And these are questions that, again, are very much owned at that big G level and need to be decided on before they come through to the operational level. And often what we are seeing is organizations are trying to put in protocols and processes around AI without actually asking those bigger questions first. What we are seeing is the urgency of really clarifying that big G, those questions that need to be answered. Who will be accountable for the misuse of AI content? What can your teams do or not do with AI? All of those questions need to be answered at that big G level. But equally, at your small G level, the design phase for your dam, making sure that your data is structured and well managed, is incredibly important before you go on and introduce those AI initiatives. In some organizations, there is an issue of content leaks. That's when the senior leadership will come in. You have your revenue and your brand reputation, which is at stake. And this is where that big G enters. A solution must be found. That solution then gets passed on to the operational teams that have to find that solution. With that sponsorship of senior leadership, there is high chances that this will be a successful delivery because this is a non-negotiable, it will be an obligation. So let's say that the content leaks often happen with creative teams. It might be because there is no official workflow or process with sign-offs and guardrails to avoid any content leaks. And so in this particular example, what was decided was to create a workflow within the dam whereby the creative teams were obliged to move through this process in order to be able to deliver those assets to specific vendors, but in a very secure way and avoid content leaks. This is an example of where it's not necessarily a view to improve efficiency, but it was driven by big G concerns, which was brand reputation and revenue. The challenge is organizations focus a lot on the governance. That tends to end up being a policy document. But if that policy document just sits on a SharePoint without being communicated or operationalized in the organization, then it's lost. The value it has no value, and it means that your teams at the small G level are operating on instinct and habit. They don't have direction, and that's where risk really comes about. I don't think it's because organizations are not thinking about how it is operationalized day to day. I think it's more the challenges that an organization is not a single monolithic entity. It has many moving parts, many different departments. And, if we look at it, the big G is owned by one, a couple of departments, and then you've got the small G that's owned by other departments. One example is you have your senior leadership, but then you've got IT that are more focused on the small G. How do you bridge that gap? I don't think it's true to say that companies don't think about operationalizing it, but perhaps it's about changing the way of seeing it and saying, okay, well, how can we make it into a living, breathing document? How do we know that what we are deciding at that big G level is actually being implemented successfully throughout our organization? Creating a definition around your governance is probably relatively easy. You have those regulations that you have to work with. When operationalizing it, I believe that is where the biggest challenge is. That's where it is harder to get it right, harder to get it consistent. How do you ensure that your governance is done the same way in one department and another? How do you manage something like AI when it's moving so quickly? What we're seeing right now is organizations quickly rushing in, creating protocols or processes around a specific AI tool. But in fact, that's only opening up the risk. Content ownership or IP and copyright questions are maybe not being dealt with correctly at that big G level. Without those decisions being made at that level, that puts the operational at risk. It means that what you're doing is not guided, it's not got a set direction. There's multiple reasons for that. One, it could be that small g governance or that design was done by people who don't actually do the work, and that creates friction. Or it's been designed in silo, not considering the people who are actually going to be impacted by that way of working. And that you go into change management and so on. The other thing is those who have been burnt by poor governance are those that will resist it because of the bad experience. They are going to be resistant to new protocols or way of working. Again, we're coming back to that challenge. That governance, it's not applied fairly across the organization. Maybe it's stricter for some and not so strict for others. And that also creates a friction within teams within the operational side. So there can be a number of reasons for it. It's a fair thing that governance does get a bad reputation, but I think that can be changed. At a small g level, it should be invisible. It means that you are actually complying without having to make a decision because the decision has already been made at the right level. If you are able to, as a practitioner, find your rights managed assets within 10 seconds, in time for you to then do your job, send them off to the vendor or whomever, that means that you've got an incredibly well-oiled machine. You have good governance at that operational level. Good governance is not having to make wrong decisions day by day. It is really removing that, and that's where governance becomes an enabler. What I'd like people to take away from the session is that really governance, there are two layers to governance. You have that big G that sets the direction, and you've got the small g, which is making sure that you are traveling in that direction. And it's also something that doesn't live in a vacuum. It is something that actually lives and breathes and needs to be consistent throughout the organization. I look forward to delving in our next session on the topic of governance at executive level and really looking at how that looks in an organization. Maybe you can start asking, how does it look in your organization? Is it working? We hope you're enjoying the conversation. If you're finding value in what you're hearing, please make sure you subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And we'd love to hear your perspective. Do you agree with what's being discussed? Have you seen different results in your organization? Is there a challenge, an opportunity, or a trend you think deserves more attention? Please reach out to our speakers and join the conversation. Some of the best discussions happen after the recording stops, and your experiences really help shape topics, ideas, and debates we'll explore in future episodes. So don't just listen, please get involved. We'd love to hear from you.